Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this week's instalment of our virtual lecture series. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our Operations Manager at Benjamin Franklin House, Caitlin Hoffman, who's going to be talking about Franklin and the joys of 18th century cooking. At the end of the lecture, there'll be some time for questions, and I'll explain how you can pose your questions when we get there. But for now, over to Caitlin.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and welcome everybody to our next installment of our weekly virtual talks. As Eleanor said, my name is Caitlin Hoffman, and I'm the Operations Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Today I will be talking to you about 18th century food and the surprising influence that Benjamin Franklin had on the eating habits of people on both sides of the Atlantic. Before I do this, though, I wanted to speak briefly about Benjamin Franklin House. We are a small historic house dedicated to telling the story of Benjamin Franklin in London in the lead up to the American Revolution. In fact, we are the only surviving Franklin home in the entire world. You'll be able to see on the left-hand side the facade of our building. We are currently closed to the public, but we hope that you'll visit us when we reopen. On the right is a picture from our historical experience, which is the core offering at the house. It's an immersive theatrical experience where we use the 18th century setting, but with 21st century technology to tell Benjamin Franklin's story. It's told through the eyes of Polly Hewson, who you can see right there in a photograph, who was the daughter of Benjamin Franklin's landlady. To find out more about our virtual programming and the house, please visit our website at www.benjaminfranklinhouse.org. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a man way ahead of his time in more ways than one. Most know him as a founding father and polymath, but he has also been known in some circles as a founding foodie. In fact, historian Ray Catherine Amy argues in her book, Stirring the Pot with Benjamin Franklin, A Founding Father's Culinary Adventures, that many of Benjamin Franklin's life milestones can be linked to food. From his younger years as a vegetarian to encouraging the use of electricity to cook a turkey, food was always a guiding force in his life. So I'll be looking at his life through this lens, focusing on how food played a role in the various stages of his life. But unlike Amy, I will be looking at the places he lived and how that affected his eating and the food, because location truly is everything. I want to speak briefly about the Georgian diet in general. The kind of food that you would eat would depend on a number of different factors, including location, so whether you lived in a city or in the countryside, status in society, so whether you're higher class or lower class, and country of origin. Now, it would take me a very long time to describe the culinary practices of every single country at the time. So for the purpose of this presentation, I will be focusing on English and Western European cuisine, and by extension, Americans of English origins. Now, in 18th century England, meat made up a large proportion of the diet, and thus became a specialty of English cuisine in the 18th century. Travelers to England at the time often commented on the abundance of meat and how well it was cooked. But an increased demand for meat meant that you couldn't always be guaranteed to get the best piece, especially in a city like London, where livestock traveled to markets from quite far off distances, and you had no idea what the process to get there, what the process was for it to get there. Fruit and vegetables were of course available at your local markets, but were usually not the main attraction in any kitchen. That is, unless you were owner of a great estate and wanted to show off the bounty from your land. Food was usually either boiled or roasted on a spit of some kind, thus not great nutritional value. For drinking, there was a multitude of options, including wine, ale, beer, and gin, if you preferred the alcoholic side of things. And also you had a multitude of hot drinks, such as tea, coffee, and hot chocolate, although most of those were appreciated by those of the higher class. What we do know is that many people did not drink drinking water, and they thought it made you unhealthy. We now know that it was most likely teeming with germs and bacteria from human waste, but back then they only knew it made them sick, and so many stuck to alcohol as their preferred beverage. Even children would have something called small beer, which was essentially boiled water mixed with beer, thus killing all that bacteria I mentioned. So now that we have a basic idea of what they would have eaten and drank in the 18th century, let's turn our attention to Benjamin Franklin and what might have influenced him. I first take you to early America. Growing up in colonial America, Benjamin Franklin would have had access to a mixture of foods. When he was a young boy, Boston, which you see in the image right there, was the biggest city and port in the colonies, bringing with it a mixture of immigrants, spices, and culinary tastes. As an American with English origins, his family would have most likely inherited recipes from the Old World, which would be similar to what people were eating in England at the time. The main difference being the produce was different. Corn, for example, was a staple of American colonial cooking, stemming from the first Puritan settlers. They would use it to make cornmeal, but they would also eat the corn itself. Early Americans, much like the rest of the 18th century world, were also heavily reliant on seasonal produce. No refrigerator or freezers at that time, unfortunately. So they needed a kitchen that fulfilled all those different needs. Now, what you can see on the screen right now are two depictions of what a colonial kitchen would have looked like. On the left-hand side is a lithograph of a drawing that was done about 100 years later than when Franklin was alive. But on the right-hand side, you'll see colonial Williamsburg and their interpretation of a kitchen. As you can see, they're quite similar, and they would have been used for the multi-purposes that you needed to have a kitchen in that time. If you were lucky to own your own land, you were usually self-sufficient and grew your own vegetables and raised your own livestock. If you lived in cities like Benjamin Franklin did, you were most likely reliant on markets with butchers, fishmongers, and fruit and vegetables from local farmers. This was practical in the spring, summer, and fall, but not so much in the winter. This meant that they needed to plan ahead by filling casks full of cornmeal, smoking meat, putting vegetables in the root cellar, drying herbs, pickling using vinegar, making jams, salting down meat for travel, and dried fruit. Franklin, having come from a working class family, is known to like simple recipes and food, which he took with him for most of his life. But he did have his favorites that he requested no matter where he was in the world. We know that he was a vegetarian for periods of his life. He read a book by Thomas Tryon that convinced him of ethical reasoning behind vegetarianism. But he also realized that he could save money by not spending it on meat and bought books instead. Now, this is a man with 2 years of formalized education, and so his vegetarianism was both good for the body and the mind. He was also, of course, famous for the invention of the lightning rod, and thought using electricity to cook meat made it more tender, encouraging other people to do so, especially with the turkey. Now that we've looked briefly at his early American years, I'd like to turn your attention to his time in London. His first time living in London was to learn the printing trade as a young man. He then returned to London in 1757 and settled at 36 Craven Street, where Benjamin Franklin House is today. He was a lodger at this house and lived with his landlady, Margaret Stevenson, who was a wealthy widow, and her daughter, Polly, who I mentioned briefly before. Polly's husband, William, eventually moved in, and they had a son, so there was always 4 to 5 people in this household at any given time. They were what we would consider a middle-class family, and most likely had servants to help with the kitchen work. What you can see on the screen right now is a still from the virtual Georgian interior, which is a digital rendering that we put together, partly thanks to the Heritage Lottery Fund, of what we think what the kitchen would have looked like in this home. If you do come to visit us at Benjamin Franklin House, I should say that this doesn't look like this now, but we do show the virtual Georgian interior to all of our guests when they come, so I would recommend to come here even if it's just to see the rest of the renderings. As you can see, it looks very similar to what an early American kitchen would have looked like, and so no doubt familiar to Franklin. The cook or kitchen maid would have prepared the food in the kitchen under the direction of Margaret Stevenson, and then bring it to the floor above for the family to eat. Their diet reflects what I mentioned before as a traditional Georgian diet, which includes lots of meat, some fruit and vegetables, and probably various types of a beverage. Although Franklin seemed to enjoy the cooking, as he mentions it several times in his humorous Craven Street Gazette, which was his chronicles of his time at 36 Craven Street, we do know that he missed some things from home. He asked for his wife, Deborah, to send apples and cranberries from Pennsylvania, and even some different types of meat. Very concerned about his health, Franklin often preached moderation and simple food, which is why he was quite shocked by how the English perceived American food, as Franklin was a big supporter of homespun food and prided on how they didn't survive on foreign imports in America, as they would have been readily available in London. So he would have seen it in contrast to his experience in Philadelphia and Boston. He did write in response to somebody mocking the love of corn in America, and he said, "Pray, let me, an American, inform the gentleman who seems quite ignorant of the matter, that Indian corn, take it for all in all, is one of the most agreeable and wholesome grains in the world. So although he is speaking specifically about corn, I do believe that it also can be extended to a metaphor about America and the colonies themselves. And this would have been really in a time when there was still a lot going on in terms of the relationship between the colonies and England. And Benjamin Franklin was trying to repair any kind of break. But unfortunately, when Benjamin Franklin left London in 1775, he realized that there was nothing left to do. But he was a firm believer in the American diet, and so tried to spread it within London while he was here. Now, in comparison, London would have seen quite a metropolis. London was the world's center of international trade, and it was overwhelmed by foreign imports such as chocolate, tea, coffee, and a variety of spices from the Far East. But nothing would really compare to the luxury that he would see in Paris, which is where I'm going to take you now. Now, when Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, he had the very important role of trying to gain support from the French during the War of Independence. He was loved by the French, who saw him as a charming older man from a far-off land. He settled in a transformed garden pavilion in the village of Passy, which was about a 30-minute drive outside of Paris at the time. He lived on a larger estate with a vegetable and fruit garden, enjoying a more upper-class diplomatic life. While he was there, he embraced a style of cooking called nouvelle cuisine, or new cooking, which was lighter fare than what he was used to in London. He wrote to his sister Jane that he preferred French cooking because they do not use as much butter in their sauce, so he hasn't had any heartburn since moving to France, which, if you do know French cuisine today, is actually quite funny to think of. Benjamin Franklin realized that eating and entertaining was a big part of a diplomat's life. And thus he played into this idea of him being a rugged colonial man by not following traditional French etiquette. He wore rough, dark clothes and was famous for wearing his bearskin hat. And the French loved it so much that a hairstyle was actually inspired by this bearskin hat. He would often also host dinner parties for other Americans in France and entertain the French upper crust, realizing the importance that food played in diplomacy. While he was in Paris, he also asked for his daughter Sally to continue to send him his favorite apples and nuts from Philadelphia, thus keeping in with the theme of missing the things from home. One thing that surprised me when I did research on Benjamin Franklin in France was that actually he played a big role in potatoes being a staple of French cuisine. In 18th century France, potatoes were actually quite unpopular. However, a French pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier promoted the potato as a potential solution to farming difficulties in France. These farming difficulties would later come up as a theme and a factor in the French Revolution, so being able to feed the masses was quite important. Franklin advised Parmentier to hold a banquet in Paris with potatoes in every single dish, including dessert. Franklin attended as a guest of honor and wrote a very great review of the meal, thus cementing potatoes as a staple in the French diet. Now, when Franklin was living in France, he could probably feel the rumblings of what would begin the slow march towards the French Revolution. Now, this was particular in the class divide that he would have seen in the country. And this is really exemplified in portraits such as this. Now, this is a family that, of course, is having hot chocolate, which was a higher class drink at the time, and really shows the disparity in between what people of the upper class would have experienced at the time versus what the people in the countryside, who were often quite starving due to poor harvests. So when Benjamin Franklin left in 1785, he would have seen how important food was to politics and democracy. Now, Benjamin Franklin then returned to Philadelphia in 1785, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. But I wanted to end this presentation with pointing out food that would have been attributed to him, has been attributed to him of having him introduced it to the American colonies, particularly when he was in London. And this really showed an ability to recognize the potential of food to kind of bridge the divide and connect cultures and communities. When Benjamin Franklin was in London, he was introduced to the soybean, which was most likely brought over from China. He sent these beans to John Bartram, who was an early botanist in Philadelphia, and encouraged him to plant some and to create paste from it. While Franklin went on a visit to Scotland, he also discovered rhubarb, again sending seeds to his friend John Bartram, and also Scotch kale. I believe that Franklin recognized the importance of food as a tool for diplomacy, as in bringing people together, but also as a scientist for learning about our natural world, and most importantly for medical purposes, how it affects our body and our overall health. Although Benjamin Franklin unfortunately developed gout in his later years, mostly thought to a poor diet, he did realize over the course of his life that food really does bring people together across all nations and all cultures. So therefore, I would definitely call him a founding foodie. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Caitlin. We now have some time for questions. So there's two ways you can ask questions. You can either use your raise hand button, and then I'll be able to unmute your microphone and you can ask Caitlin your question directly over the audio. Or if you prefer to type your question, you can use your Q&A button. So there's one question that's come up on the Q&A. Okay, the first question is, what was Franklin's favorite food?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. I think he had many different types of favorite food. Through my research, I saw that he enjoyed fish quite a lot. As a vegetarian, he would spend a lot of time not eating meat, and so he found he ate fish a lot. If I did mention the book about his culinary adventures, and Ray Catherine Amy also suggests that he enjoyed biscuits a lot. So yeah, thank you for that question.
And another question, you said that Franklin recommended cooking meat with electricity. How would that have been done at that time? And that was from Anne Bagamary.
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. Yes, so he basically, well, when he did his experiments with electricity, he found a way to harness it. And so I think the idea was to have a jolt of electricity go through it. And it was said to make the meat more tender, which is why he encouraged people to do it.
Another question, this time from Brad Jasinski. At what age did Ben Franklin develop gout? When did he begin to gain weight and not follow a healthy diet?
So that's a very good question. So he developed gout later in his life. So it was most apparent towards the end of his time in Paris, and then when he was in Philadelphia for the last years of his life. And I'm not exactly sure why his diet worsened. It may just be that over time with the Georgian diet, it just didn't do well for his health, unfortunately.
And a follow-on question from Amy Werble. Did they know at the time which foods made gout worse?
So again, that's a very interesting question. I think that a lot of the texts at the time were saying that an unhealthy diet, we can interpret that to mean whatever that means, considering that at that time they didn't have the medical knowledge that we do today. But I'm assuming it doesn't help to have beer every day. So having alcohol and then poor hygiene and water. So yes, thank you for that question. I'm sorry I couldn't answer it any more deeply.
Another question, this time from Jakob and Yasin. Was it unusual to be a vegetarian at that period?
Again, that's a very good question. So there were quite a few people who were ethical vegetarians. So there was a small group of people who did believe in vegetarianism, but for the most part, meat was the main kind of form of sustenance that people would have at that time. So if you were an ethical vegetarian, it was probably seen as quite strange in your community.
And a question from Reem, were there other vegetables and herbs which were widely introduced during that Georgian period?
So a lot of the vegetables that we see are the ones that can be kept for longer periods of time. So I mentioned briefly something about a root cellar. So it was a lot of things like carrots, you know, beets, onions, you know, those sort of things that can be kept in a cellar for longer periods of time. So those were kind of the main vegetables. But as I mentioned, if you had a bountiful amount of vegetables, it was usually a sign that you were quite wealthy because you were able to get that from your land.
So a couple of questions relating to the foods that Franklin had sent to him in London. So a question about how which foods he had to send to Philadelphia, and also how they might spoil during the voyage.
I'm so sorry, you were breaking up there, Eleanor, so I didn't quite hear what you said.
So two questions about the food that was sent from Ben Franklin's wife in Philadelphia. The first being what were the types of food, and the second, how are they kept from spoiling on the journey over to England?
That's a good question as well. So Franklin really he really enjoyed certain apples from his part of the world in Pennsylvania. So he had his wife send over quite a lot of apples, certain nuts as well. We do know that while he was living in London, particularly, that he sent over a lot of cranberries, for example. And then also there was some meat that they sent over. So they would have, for the long journey over, because it would take about 28 days or so for you to travel from Philadelphia to London over boat through the across the sea. So they would have salted down the meat to make sure that it was able to last the journey. And then they would usually have barrels of apples with some sort of they would be kept in these barrels that would have some sort of thing in it to make sure that they didn't go bad. I mean, of course, occasionally you had things go bad on the way over, but that's how they would do that in that time.
Thank you. A question from Andrew Watt that's asking, was Franklin interested more in the art or the science of food? And he's asking if maybe he wasn't actually a foodie, but more interested in the science.
That's a really good point. So I guess because these days we think of someone who's a foodie as somebody who appreciates food. And actually, as a man who appreciated simple food the most, he probably was interested more in the science behind the cooking. I know that when he was living in Paris, he often wrote back to his family, but also the Stevenson family in London about the different kind of ways of cooking that he found when he was in Paris, because that was really a turning point for him in terms of cooking, as he had a whole staff that he could basically, as a diplomat, that he was able to cook many different types of dishes. So, and he also invented something called the Franklin stove. So he was definitely interested in ways of cooking, but also kind of the science behind it. So that is a good point. I do think that he was definitely interested in the science.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions. Anne Beggar Marie has asked, when he was living at Craven Street, did they have this all together?
Sorry, could you please repeat that question again? I didn't quite hear it.
When he was living at Craven Street, did they have family dinners all together?
So that's actually really interesting as well. So Benjamin Franklin was a lodger at 36 Craven Street, and so actually, as part of the etiquette at that time, it was actually he had quite a bizarre situation. Normally, he wouldn't have been allowed to eat with the family, but actually, he was quite close to the family, so he would often have dinners with them in what we call the card room part of the house, which is kind of the private area for the family. So they would normally have meals together. Yes.
Thank you. Peter Agar has asked what it was that made him give up being a vegetarian. Did he reject the original ethical case that he wrote in the book you mentioned?
So again, that's a good question. So I think that he had periods where he went back from being vegetarian and not, and I think partly was maybe convenience as well. So if you're in an area where there is a multitude of fresh options, he probably would prefer that. But also I'm sure there were cultural aspects of it. So as a diplomat in foreign places, you kind of adapt to the culture of the place that you're in. So I think partly because meat was so abundant in most places, he probably from a practical point of view would have also started to eat meat. But he did at various points of his life go in between being vegetarian and not.
Just two more questions. One is from Jakob and Yasin again. Was he following more the American or British diet, in your opinion?
So in my opinion, he preferred the American diet, so a much simpler diet, less sauces, more kind of a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables, and kind of the homespun that I mentioned before. But as I said, while he was living in London and in Paris, he adapted to those style of cuisines, and so he got to experience kind of everything. But I think he would have preferred the American one.
And last question from a couple of different people. Is there any evidence of Ben Franklin actually doing any cooking?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Apologies. The last question from a couple of different people was, is there any evidence of Ben Franklin doing any cooking of his own?
Well, that's a good question. When he was a younger man, and he was definitely in the vegetarian phase of his life, he did a lot more cooking. At that time period, it was quite common for women to be in the domain of the kitchen, but definitely when he was a young man, when he was honing in his printing trade, he did cooking himself, and he writes a little bit about doing cooking for himself in his autobiography. But I think for most of his life, he would have had other people doing the cooking for him.
Thank you so much again, Caitlin, for that wonderful talk, and to everyone who was able to join us this afternoon. At the same time next week, we have our writer-in-residence, George Goodwin, who's going to be talking about his book, London, which is like the magazine context. And so if you're interested in finding details about other upcoming events, you can visit our website, and we are offering all of this virtual lecture series for free, but if you would like to donate to support the house and its work, you can also do that on our website. Thank you very much.